Well, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to episode 26 of EV Society's Canada Talks Electric Cars webinar. Approximately 1/4 of the harmful greenhouse gas emissions causing the climate crisis come from transportation. Electric vehicles are not only a pleasure to drive and own, they represent low-hanging fruit in the fight against climate change. Given the growing sense of urgency, what actionable priorities should be taken to ensure faster EV adoption? There are plenty of great ideas, and today we'll be exploring strategies being promoted by Canada's vehicle manufacturers. Before we get going into that, I'm going to launch a poll. I'm just curious to find out from the audience what you believe are some of the more important actions that we should be taking. And I'm going to launch that poll. You may answer up to 3 of the options that you're given here. So if you wouldn't mind taking just a moment and reading through those and clicking the ones that you think are most relevant. While you're doing that, I'm going to mention that in the recorded version of this webinar, the poll does not show up. So I will quickly read the results once they come in and share them with folks watching later on our playlist. Actually, I can read those now quickly. Which 3 actions will be most effective in speeding EV adoption? Well, it could be increased public understanding of EV benefits, better EV purchase incentives, federal and provincial, improve EV charging infrastructure, more chargers and greater reliability, mandate automakers to sell an increasing percentage of zero emission vehicles, which is known as a ZEV mandate, zero emission vehicle mandate, raise standards for a higher ICE fuel economy and lower tailpipe emissions. And finally, the last option is increase carbon tax. So results are coming in. We've got about 70% of the room so far, and it's still going. So we'll give it just a couple more seconds, and then I will share the results. 83% and a few more coming in. I am going to stop it when we hit 90, I think. And there, we'll just leave it there. I'm going to end this poll and share the results. And for those watching on the YouTube playlist, we have about 57% say education of the public should be a priority. 64% believe better EV purchase incentives. Also 64% say we need better charging infrastructure and more chargers. Half of the room thinks a mandate for automakers to sell more, greater percentage of zero emission vehicles is critical. Raise standards for higher ICE fuel economy and lower tailpipe emissions, 22%. And then finally, increase the carbon tax, 21%. So kind of a mixture. It looks like all of these things play a role for most of you, but clearly some of them you believe are more important. So thank you for that. We will move forward. But before I do introduce today's speaker, I'd like to remind you that we'll be taking your questions as we usually do using the Zoom's Q&A. Remember that you can upvote any questions that you want to hear answered using that thumbs up feature on the toolbar. Jason Arnaud is back again to monitor your questions and introduce them at the appropriate time. As is our practice, the webinar will end no later than 8:30 Eastern Standard Time. Today, we welcome Mr. Brian Kingston, who will present the actions that his industry believes are necessary to supercharge sales and EV adoption in Canada. Brian is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, or as you will hear through the webinar, the CVMA. The CVMA represents Canada's leading manufacturers of light and heavy duty motor vehicles. Its membership includes Ford Motor Company of Canada, General Motors of Canada, and Stellantis. Prior to joining CVMA, Brian was Vice President of Policy, Fiscal and International at the Business Council of Canada, where he led the Council's economic policy priorities and global engagement. From about 2009 to 2012, he served in the federal government with positions at the Department of Finance, Global Affairs Canada, Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada, the Treasury Board, Secretariat, and the Privy Council Office. In addition to his accomplishments in business and government, Brian is active in the nonprofit sector, including as past president of the Ottawa Economics Association, as a current board member of the Banff Forum. Brian holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Carleton, a master's degree in international affairs from the Norman Peterson School of International Affairs, and an MBA from Ivey Business School. Hey, Brian, welcome to Canada Talks Electric Cars. Great to have you on.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for the introduction and great to be here.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to get out of your way and let you have at it. Great.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate the invite to be here this evening. I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller, so it's an honor to be here, and really looking forward to the discussion and hopefully some good questions. So I'm going to jump right into it. I've got a presentation I'm going to take you through. Should take me about 20-25 minutes, and I'm going to talk about two things. First, some of the trends that we're seeing in the transition to electrification in the manufacturing sector in Canada, and what that all means for the Canadian economy. And then I'll turn to the key topic here, which is supercharging EV sales. So what's it going to take to increase sales and to ultimately achieve the targets that have been set? So with that, on to my first slide. I apologize, I'm an economist by training. As you outlined, Tim, there in my intro, I always like to start with a little bit of Econ 101 on where we're at in the industry and how important it is to Canada. So automotive manufacturing, it's one of Canada's largest manufacturing sectors. Vehicle production last year was 1.1 million units. And just to note that is down significantly from pre-COVID levels, where we would be between 2010 and 2019, around 2 million units of production annually. There have been a number of challenges facing the industry since COVID, of course, lockdowns initially. Now there's a persistent global semiconductor challenge, shortages throughout the supply chain, and there have been trade disruptions, most notably and most recently, the Ambassador Bridge blockade. So a lot of headwinds facing the industry, but auto manufacturers are best in class when it comes to logistics. And so production is increasing again, and expect to get 1.3, 1.4 million units of production this year, and then heading back towards 2 million in the coming years. The industry employs about 117,000 people directly. If you look at the broader dealership network and aftermarket, an additional 400,000 plus Canadians employed. So a very big employment footprint here in Canada. And motor vehicles are our second largest goods export, $37 billion in exports in 2021. Again, that's down quite a bit from what we would have seen pre-COVID, but expect that to increase over time. And no surprise that the US is far and away our largest export market. Over 90%, 92% of our exports went to the United States last year. And that's been pretty consistent over the years. And really why that is because we have an auto industry that is completely integrated in North America, really since the 1960s. We've got harmonized rules and regulations, everything from emission standards through to safety certification standards that are aligned with the US. And that's what allows for economies of scale. And that's what allows really for manufacturing to occur in Canada, because we can export into this one integrated North American market. I'll touch on that a little bit more later. So to start, the EV transition, well, it's well underway. And this is a chart that's been pulled from the International Energy Agency in their most recent global EV outlook. So this shows you right here the number of available electric car models with the driving range denoted by the dots there. As you can see, no surprise, range is increasing as the technology advances. And so every single year, we're seeing more and more electric vehicles coming into the market. Current expectation is around 57 million vehicle sales, plug-in electric vehicle sales through 2025. That number is constantly changing, but that's the current estimate that we're seeing out there. If you look at Canada in terms of electric car models, there's 75 zero emission vehicle models available right now. And again, that's changing constantly. We'll be well over 100 into next year, and more to come as automakers bring more and more product to market and electrify more of their vehicle offerings. Next chart, very similar, but wanted to show you the pace of transformation taking place in the industry right now. This is also from the IEA. A little bit hard to read, but the key point here is this. If you look at 2010, 2011, 2012, really up to 2016, the dots here indicate when an automaker has made an announcement with respect to EV sales targets. And it's relatively sparse between 2010 and 2016, and then it really starts to pick up. And by the time you hit 2021, virtually every automaker is making an announcement and a commitment on EV sales targets. So truly a transformation taking place right now, and it's accelerating. Not a week goes by where you don't see some announcement from an automaker with respect to electrifying a new vehicle, a new line, or a new investment being made into EV assembly or the battery supply chain. In sum, the current estimate for total investment into electrification by OEMs is approximately $515 billion US. And again, that's changing constantly, but huge amounts of money are being invested into this transition right now. Now I'm going to zero in a little bit on the members of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. So Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. Ford is now investing over US $50 billion into EVs. That's through to 2026. Their expectation is about 40 to 50% of global vehicle volume to be fully electric by 2030. And big investments are being made into production. So 2 million annual vehicle production by 2026. And I'll talk shortly about what that means for Canada specifically. General Motors, EV and AV investments from 2020 through 2025 are totaling US $35 billion. They're on track to deliver 30 new EVs by 2025 globally. 2/3 of that will be available here in North America, and capacity to build 1 million EVs in North America by mid-decade. And then last but not least, of course, Stellantis, 30 billion euros through 2025 into both electrification and software. And their target is 75 battery electric vehicle models by 2030. And they're going to have capacity for 5 million units of production annually by the end of this decade. So major investments by these three companies into this transition, and it's constantly accelerating. So what does that mean for Canada? The important question. Well, if you follow me, you've probably seen this chart a few times, but really exciting news for the Canadian economy and Canadians over the past 2 years. We've witnessed $13.5 billion in investment from Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, direct job creation of 6,000 jobs, tens of thousands throughout the supply chain when you look at the broader auto supply chain that will support these investments that are being made. And just to give you an example of some of these, Ford at their Oakville facility, $1.8 billion there to turn it into a battery electric vehicle manufacturing facility through 2024. Stellantis with a couple of major investments quite recently. Both their Windsor and Brampton assembly plants are going to be retooled for a new flexible architecture where they can build battery electric vehicles as well as other types of vehicles. And then $5 billion for a battery plant in Windsor. And with that comes Stellantis' very first battery lab in North America, where they're going to be doing really advanced research on EV batteries. So this is a big one, and this is part of the broader EV battery supply chain, which I'll touch on a little bit later. General Motors, some very big announcements recently. The CAMI facility at Ingersoll is building and being retooled right now to build the electric BrightDrop. It's an electric transit van which has proven to be extremely popular. Some really big sales into fleets in the United States very recently. And on top of that, they've invested $500 million into Quebec for a cathode anode facility. So this is, again, part of that broader battery supply chain, and really exciting to see Canada playing a role in that. So big developments here, and bodes well for the industry moving forward and for the Canadian economy, given some of those statistics I outlined at the start of the presentation. So that gives you a bit of a sense of where we're at in terms of the OEM transformation to electrification and what's occurring here in Canada. Now I'm going to turn to some of the trends that we're seeing for electric vehicle sales in Canada, and then some of the barriers. And I'm really happy you posted that poll. I'll touch on that in a moment. And apologies, this chart, this is from Statistics Canada. I just love the infographic. It goes to 2021, but I'll read out the most recent sales data that we're seeing. So as you can see here, very, very slow growth between 2011 and 2016, really, and then it starts to accelerate. So 2020, ZEV registrations hit 3.52%. Last 2021, we hit 5.6%. And in the very first quarter of 2022, that jumped up to 8.3%. So you're really starting to see that technology adoption curve start to move up. Now, obviously, we're still a far way off from 100% by 2035, but encouraging to see that at least the curve is moving in the right direction. So how do we actually get to 100% sales? This is the wheel, the Road to 35 wheel. I encourage you, if you haven't had a look at our roadto35.ca website, to check it out. What we've tried to do is outline some of the key steps that need to be taken to boost electric vehicle sales, and most recently introduced an EV dashboard, which looks at both charging gaps and incentive gaps, and I'll speak to that in a little more detail shortly. But in short, in sum, what we see as necessary to get ourselves to that 100% target is really four things. First of all, we've got to enhance zero emission vehicle consumer purchase incentives. So incentives need to be larger. We need to see more incentives in provinces that don't have them, and they have to be applicable to a wider range of vehicles. We're seeing more and more large SUVs, pickup trucks being electrified, and these are vehicles that Canadians and North Americans love. This is a huge share of the market. As those vehicles come into the market, they're going to have bigger batteries to deliver the range that people want, and therefore they will be more expensive. The price will come down eventually as the technology develops, but consumer incentives are going to be absolutely critical if you're going to win over that segment of the market. So that's first. We need an accessible public charging and fueling infrastructure. Obviously, there's more to charging than just public charging. There's a huge amount of work to do on multi-unit residential building, charging at home, grid infrastructure, clean electricity generation. But we see the public charging infrastructure gap is a big barrier right now. And it was good to see that your poll confirmed that. So that has to be addressed. Public awareness, another key element of the wheel. I do a lot of interviews and radio on electric vehicles, and I'm always getting questions around EV performance, range concerns, cold weather operation, questions around charging. And these are valid questions. People have a lot of questions and are still trying to understand the technology. So more to do on education, because the technology is advancing extremely rapidly, and a lot of the sort of preconceived notions around EVs, many times I'll find that they're kind of outdated ideas that people have from maybe 5 years ago when ranges were much smaller. So a lot of advancement here, but some work to do on the education side. And then lastly, and this is where there's a big economic opportunity, the battery supply chain. We've got these big investments in Canada now for EV assembly, battery assembly, but there is a huge economic opportunity if you look down through the supply chain and into critical minerals. So I'm going to touch on all of these barriers, and these are really the key elements if we're going to supercharge our sales. So barriers to EV adoption. And these are very consistent. There are so many polls out there now on EVs. It's a very hot topic. I pulled this from Deloitte's 2022 Global Automotive Consumer Study, but you can look at any source. Pollution Probe just did a great survey on charging infrastructure. The federal government's doing its own surveys through Enercan. DeRosier had one. JD Power just put one out, and your own poll, Tim, that you just did, confirmed the exact same things that we see here. It's always the same factors when you ask Canadians about EV adoption. They're interested in EVs. They're interested in the technology. They're more and more seriously considering making this purchase. But it's always the same things. There's questions around range, there's questions around cost, and there's questions around charging infrastructure, particularly people that don't have the ability at home to install a charger. So firmly believe that if we're going to supercharge sales and hit those targets, we have got to have a laser focused strategy on these items and address them now. Build out confidence in Canadians, make sure that these vehicles are affordable for everybody, and we will see that adoption curve increase. So with that, I'm going to drill down into two of these specific areas, and this comes right from our Road to 35 EV readiness dashboard. So the first is the consumer incentive gap. What we did is we looked at the consumer incentives, the purchase incentives available to Canadians at both the federal and provincial level. We added them together, so the $5,000 that you get from the federal government through IZEV, plus whatever some provinces are offering. And you'll note here that there are many provinces that don't have an incentive. And then we compared that to the federal US EV tax credit. So that's a US $7,500 income tax credit if you purchase an EV, and then added on the California state level incentive. Why California, you ask? Because the federal government likes to compare itself to California when it comes to EVs and EV sales. And California is far ahead of Canada when it comes to actually putting serious investments into this transition. The last two California state budgets, just the last two, dedicated $10 billion US to charging infrastructure and to incentives. So there's a lot of real money being put behind this, and we thought it was a good comparison. So as you can see here, there's not a single jurisdiction in Canada that matches the US at the state and federal level, and that's a problem. Quebec gets close, but even then Quebec's starting to dial back the size of its incentive. And why is this so important? Well, the median market income in Canada right now is about $56,000. That is below your average transaction cost of a compact SUV EV. So, I don't know about you, but I don't know many people or families that purchase a vehicle that costs more than their annual salary. So we've got to, if we're going to accelerate this adoption, we've got to have better incentives in the market to make this affordable for everybody. And it's becoming particularly important right now because we're obviously facing a cost of living crisis. Inflation's at 3-decade highs, does not appear to be going anywhere. Central banks and the Bank of Canada are continuing to increase interest rates to get a hold on inflation. And we are seeing price increases throughout the supply chain, not just the automotive supply chain, but virtually every supply chain you can look at. So prices are increasing. Battery mineral inputs are at prices now we haven't seen since the early 2000s. So despite all of these previous forecasts and estimates that we saw over the past couple of years that were saying we would reach price parity EV and ICE by mid-decade, that is not the current trend that we're on. There will be price parity at some point because the technology is getting better, and it's getting better every day. And as automakers put more and more into this, and the scale that comes with these global automakers is huge. But the reality is there are price and cost pressures throughout the supply chain, and we've got to just be realistic about that and provide Canadians with better incentives if we're going to make this switch happen. So $5,000, a good starting point, but it's not going to be enough, particularly for larger vehicles coming to the market. And the incentive needs to be broadened to apply to those bigger vehicles, pickup trucks, SUVs. They need to be eligible for these incentives, and most of them are not right now. So this is key. If we get this right, we will see an increase in sales, and I expect you'd see it happen rather rapidly. Just to note one other comparator if you compare Canada's federal incentive to top 20 jurisdictions in the world with a federal incentive, we don't even rank in the top 20. So we're not even in the picture when it comes to providing strong incentive to consumers, and that has to be addressed. The leading jurisdictions in the world all have better incentive packages than we do. So with that, I'll jump to charging infrastructure. Another key element of getting more confidence in Canadians to make the switch and to purchase an EV. And there are a number of metrics out there. One of the real frustrations I find in the whole realm of charging and charging policy is that no one even agrees on the nomenclature. Everyone measures it differently. There's different ratios that the different jurisdictions are using, which makes it really challenging to kind of wrap your analysis around a key metric. But what we've done here is what we looked at the current vehicle fleet in Canada and assumed that what happens if half of that becomes electrified? We didn't put a date on it. Let's just say half of it, we get to 50% of our fleet being electric. And then we applied the ratio that California uses for vehicles on the road to charging infrastructure. They use a 7-to-1 ratio. They also include public and shared private charging. If you look at the European Union, they use a 10-to-1 ratio, and that's just pure public charging infrastructure. So you can use different ratios, but you're going to conclude the same thing, which is we need millions of public chargers. And right now we're sitting at 16,000 EVSE ports in Canada. Federal government's committed to another 50,000. I am very concerned that we're not even close to having a target that puts us on track to make this convenient and affordable for everybody. If you forecast out the vehicle fleet to 2050, we use the Canada Energy Regulator, they have a fleet forecast. We're going to have 39 million electric vehicles on the road by 2050, assuming we hit all the sales targets. So take that figure and apply a 10-to-1 ratio to it. That's 3.9 million public chargers. You can use the California ratio if you include public and shared private. That's 5.5 million chargers. The numbers they're eye-wateringly large, and it just underlines the point that we've got a long way to go. It's not all on the federal government, of course. There will be a private sector imperative here and an opportunity, frankly, when more EVs are on the road, but that's not the case right now. There are so few on the road that it is not a space where you're going to see a huge amount of private sector activity without government support. So we've been calling on the federal government to do more, to be more ambitious, to come up with a plan that really outlines how we're going to build this charging infrastructure, does us some analysis on whether or not we've got the grid capacity to support all of these chargers that need to go in, making sure that we've got a clear view into some of the utility charging approaches across the country. Just to give you an example, the last thing you want to have happen is someone buys an EV, they upgrade their panel to 200 amp, and then they find out that they have to actually pay for a transformer upgrade or a line upgrade for their neighborhood. These are the types of challenges that we're going to see more and more of as more people buy electric vehicles. So we need some very, very clear thinking on this, and we need a plan. And right now I'm not seeing one, and that's what worries me. So big gap here, and very curious for any questions or thoughts on charging infrastructure. I haven't even gotten into the MERB side of things, but I would just point you to some excellent work that has been done by Pollution Probe in the past, for example. But that is obviously another key area for people who live in a multi-unit residential building. Upwards of 30% of Canadians are in that position. And if you can't easily have a charger installed at your building, in your parking lot, or get to publicly accessible, you're going to be in a difficult position. So a lot of work to do on that. This is really focused here on the public charging gap. So a lot of work to do, and we're trying to get some more clarity around the analysis that's being done. You can look at other jurisdictions that have got a real serious plan here. Germany has got an approach to this. They're trying to build 1 million public chargers through 2030. And even California, they do regular assessments of the charging gaps in the state and put money behind a plan to make sure that those gaps are filled. So I'll leave it there. I could talk about public charging infrastructure all day long, but it's a big area of concern, and it's something that absolutely needs to be addressed. And I think that aligned well with the poll there, Tim, that you posed at the start. And now I'll just turn to the last piece about the wheel and the opportunity here in Canada. If we address all of these infrastructure and incentive gaps, and we start to see EV adoption really increase, there is a big opportunity, and I would argue a generational opportunity in the battery supply chain. We now have the investments into assembly. We've got Stellantis building a multi-billion-dollar battery plant in Windsor, and all of this is going to have to be fed by critical minerals. And I've taken this from the government of Ontario. It's just a nice visualization of the opportunity, right from mineral exploration through to application and eventually recycling. And just to give you a sense of the scale of this opportunity, most recent IEA projections are for if the world is going to reach net zero by 2050, we need 6 times more mineral inputs by 2040 than we have today. So this is a huge, huge amount of new mining and processing that needs to occur. And the majority of that will be for EV batteries and for battery storage applications. And Canada's unique here. We're the only nation in the Western Hemisphere that has the complete suite of mineral deposits that are required in electric vehicle batteries. We've all seen the maps of Canada with the dots that show where the deposits are. The deposits are here. We've got lithium, 3 million tons of lithium. We're the 5th largest producer of nickel in the world. We've got nickel refineries. And cobalt, we're the 8th largest producer in the world. Again, another key mineral in EV batteries. So the potential's there, and the federal government's put $3.8 billion behind a critical mineral strategy. The reality is, though, a lot of these deposits are in hard to reach places. There's limited infrastructure, maybe no electricity, electrical grid connections. So we've got to make this accessible. We've got to make it attractive to companies to come and mine. And importantly, we've got to attract the processing capacity so that these minerals ultimately will be of the quality needed for an EV battery and feed into that battery supply chain. So huge, huge opportunity right here. I would just note, to tie it into my very first point around this industry, we can't do anything in this space without an eye to the broader North American market. There's no such thing as a Canadian EV battery supply chain. We are totally integrated with the US. Our aligned regulations have allowed for that. It gives us the economies of scale that we need. So I would just note that we've got to think of this in a North American context. That's why we renegotiated the USMCA, the old NAFTA agreement, to make sure that we continue to have duty-free access into the United States for vehicles. And as we think about this battery supply chain, it's got to be viewed through that integrated North American market lens, because we simply can't do it alone. We're too small, and we have the blessing of sitting on top of the wealthiest economy in the world, in the United States. So big opportunity, but we have to move quickly because companies are moving very fast right now and trying to secure as many of these resources and inputs as possible. And if we can't provide those inputs now, we could miss out. So big opportunity, but we've got to move quickly. So I think that summarizes. That takes me to about 27 minutes, right on time. Happy to get any questions. Please contact me if you have any thoughts on our road to 35, the infrastructure gaps, the consumer incentive gaps. Always interested in any additional research or thinking on this space. So Tim, I think I'll stop there and turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Brian. And I'm going to flip it further down the line and let Jason jump in. It looks like we have no shortage of questions today. So right. Jason, if you would.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Brian. Definitely no shortage of questions today. The first one is regarding charging. And basically, if the vast majority of charging is done at home, do we really need that many public chargers and, out and about?
Yeah, great question. And I hear it all the time. And you're right. Yes, the majority of charging should and can be done at home for those Canadians that live in a home that will accommodate that. Where we have a challenge is about 30% of Canadians in multi-unit residential. That can be addressed with new builds. We've seen some jurisdictions put in place in the building code, for example, that a new build has to have, at a minimum, roughed in electrical for chargers. But we're sitting on a very old building stock, and a lot of these old buildings are very difficult to retrofit, or if it's possible, it is extremely expensive. And there's very little motivation for a commercial building owner to put that retrofit in place unless there's some sort of support for government or an overwhelming demand from residents. So we need to have accessible public charging infrastructure for people that are in that position in particular. So that can be in an urban setting, that can be on-street charging. You're starting to see more of that in Montreal, for example. Or it can be large-scale charging parking lots where you can get a fast charge. The other reason we need such an extensive network is because we have some very unique Canadian conditions. We have 1.1 million kilometers of public two-lane road in this country. I mean, it's no surprise to anyone who's going to be on this webinar. Canada is massive, and we do a lot of driving. And you may not drive, the typical estimated range of someone in their daily commute is 50 kilometers. That's fine. You'll be able to handle that with an EV, no problem. But we need to make sure that this is convenient for someone to make the switch. And somebody that does that, twice a year, they take that 1,200 kilometer road trip. If we don't have charging infrastructure, publicly accessible, fast charging that is visible, not lined up, easy to use, we're going to have a problem. And I'll just point you to Norway. I was just there recently for this electric vehicle symposium. Their target was to put public charging on every 50 kilometers of highway. And the thinking there was simply that you have to make it convenient. You don't want a scenario where someone gets to a charging station and it's lined up, there's a big wait, or there just simply isn't enough in terms of spacing along highways. So that's another key factor. The last unique Canadian condition is that we do have a cold weather climate. And electric vehicle battery performance, while it's getting better, cold weather performance is going to be a challenge. So if you live in rural Canada, 20% of our population is in rural areas, you're going to need more charging infrastructure. So when I look at the ratios that other jurisdictions are using, 7-to-1, 10-to-1, I would argue we're probably going to be on the more aggressive side of that because of those unique Canadian conditions. So it seems like a lot. I agree. You look at those numbers and it seems almost impossible to get to it, but that's the reality. If we're going to switch our energy system over from gas powered to electric, those are the types of numbers we're going to need in terms of EV charging ports.
And just to revisit the assumptions for that slide, I think you quoted about 50% of the fleet.
Yes. So
that's not 50% of new car sales, that's 50% of all vehicles on the road.
Exactly. That figures on the basis of getting to a 50% fleet, and that's going to take time. I'll just give you one more example on that. Norway's hit 80% EV sales. Their fleet is currently only at 17-18%. So even if we get to 100%, there's a lag because it takes time for the vehicle fleet to turn over. So if you look at a fully electrified fleet, that's about 2050 if we hit the targets. And that's where you get the 3.9 million EV charger figure if we have a 39 million ZEV fleet on the road, but that is a ways off.
Okay, so we have time, we have work to do. I expect as fast charging continues to improve, I mean, by comparison, we have what, 12,000 gas stations in the country. As fast charging times drop, I expect that number will start to balance out.
It's an excellent point, and that's a key factor here. If you look at the 12,000 gas stations, you've got anywhere from 6 to 12 pumps, but within 5 minutes, you get 600 kilometers of range with a gas pump. Fast charging isn't there yet, but the technology will advance over time. And in the perfect world, you can get to a similar scenario where you can get that type of range, maybe not 5 minutes. That's probably a better place for a battery expert to talk about, but it will get better over time. That said, what's working against those charging times is the fact that we are now having larger batteries in vehicles because people want bigger range, and in North America in particular, like bigger vehicles. So you've got a bigger battery, which requires fast charging and potentially a longer time to fuel it up.
Okay, the next one is related to charging as well. Are any of your members considering installing their own charging infrastructure in North America? Of course, Tesla superchargers is one example, and Curry, who posted this question, said that's what's making a significant difference in adoption.
Yes, so some are. General Motors, as an example, has recently unveiled a plan to install tens of thousands of chargers across North America at dealerships, but also at other areas. So you are seeing OEM investments into that space right now. That said, I think you're going to see a lot of very interesting business models emerging as the on-road EV fleet gets larger. The most obvious, of course, is gas stations, which are putting EV charging in, but you're also seeing all kinds of interesting models. So malls, large big box stores putting in chargers as a way to attract people. And if you look at other more mature markets, you've got companies that are finding ways to make basically an attractive place to charge your vehicle. Let's offer other services. Let's make this a destination that people want to go to and are quite happy to spend 20 or 30 minutes. So it's a very fluid space. And I think you're going to see a lot of really interesting business models as the EV fleet grows in size.
Great, thank you. On to battery supply chain, you talked a little bit about that and the increases in raw materials required. Do any of those projections that you talked about factor in older batteries hitting end of life and being recycled and fed back into the supply chain?
So when you look at the prices that I was speaking about are just current spot prices in the market for minerals that are being used in EV batteries largely and other storage, battery storage applications. That said, you make a good point. There will be, and frankly, I don't think it's possible to achieve the global EV sales targets without recycling playing a very big role in this. There's a lot of innovative companies that have unique recycling models, patented technology that they're developing right now. And that will provide a boost in terms of overall supply of the minerals needed for EV batteries. So a battery will reach its end of life, its useful end of life in a vehicle. It'll be recycled, and a significant portion of that could be actually returned into the battery supply chain and repurposed into a new vehicle. So that will moderate potentially some of these big surges in demand we're seeing right now for mined critical minerals as you see more and more recycled product come into the market. Again, the challenge we're seeing right now is there just aren't enough vehicles that have reached that point where they're now going to be recycled. So we will get there as the market matures, but it's still very much early stage right now.
Great. Next question from Glenn. Bloomberg NEF has reviewed the legacy OEM EV's commitments and found that they will not meet the US and Canadian federal EV goals for 2030. Would you like to comment on that finding?
I haven't seen that specific finding from Bloomberg. I would just note, and I'd point you to some of the recent comments from the CEO of Stellantis FCA Canada. When big global automakers like Stellantis, 400,000 employees, these are massive companies with true expertise in global supply chains and automotive manufacturing. When these companies are moving at the pace they are with the investments of the scale that I outlined, 30, 50, $35 billion, you will see a huge ramp up in production. 8 million from my 3 member companies alone on an annual basis. And that could potentially be much larger when you include all the other OEMs. So all I would say to that finding, I'd have to look at the finding, but these companies are best in class when it comes to manufacturing. And with the amount of money they're putting behind this, I'm pretty confident you're going to see a huge ramp up. And virtually every vehicle offered in their line, it has a plan to be electrified over the next couple of years. So I'm not too concerned about some of those projections.
Okay, thank you. A bit on the technical side, Volker asks, how much cold weather testing is going on for battery development and performance?
There is a lot of cold weather testing going on because obviously this is key for battery performance, and there are a number of markets where cold weather is a factor. So I can't give you an exact figure on the amount of R&D spend on it, but battery longevity and cold weather operation concerns are something we hear consistently about, not just in Canada, but if you look at northern US states as well. So there is a lot of research and time being spent on finding ways to ensure that the batteries can operate as effectively and efficiently in a cold weather climate as they can in a warmer weather climate. But I'm happy to follow up on that if I can give you some specifics on what the actual kind of amounts look like in terms of what the companies are doing.
That would be great. Thank you. Onto the political and government side of things, do you see the Ford government bringing back an EV subsidy in Ontario soon for consumers?
I hope so. And we've been making the case very, very strongly for an EV incentive in Ontario. The Ford government's been very successful in building out the industry, attracting this investment into the province. And we've been making the case that, that's amazing from an economic perspective. That said, for this transition to work is we need people to buy EVs. That's kind of part of the equation here. And the best way to do that is with an incentive. So it doesn't necessarily have to be kind of cash on the hood. That's the best and most appealing to the consumer. But there are other models like the US model where it's an income tax credit. You could have a provincial income tax credit for an EV purchase. There are other types of things you can do to incentivize this. So I'm hopeful that we'll get there and we'll see something in Ontario. The reason Ontario is so important is because if you look at the overall sales targets, they are not achievable if Ontario doesn't have an incentive. Ontario is the biggest auto market in Canada for vehicle sales. So it's key. It's key. There has to be something in Ontario to help more Ontarians make that switch. And that's why Ontario lags other provinces. When there was an incentive, big spike in interest, big spike in sales. The second it was pulled from the market, it dropped off a cliff.
Okay, thank you. Next question is a bit of a two-parter. How would a ZEV mandate bring vehicles quicker to consumers if there's shortages on components? And I think this ties into what we're going through right now over the last year, where demand vastly outstrips supply.
Yeah, so in short, it won't make a difference. And this is why whenever the ZEV mandate is raised as a policy idea, sometimes I have to check the calendar and make sure we haven't gone back in time. I mean, it is an outdated policy from another era. I feel like people are stuck in the 90s when you're talking about a ZEV mandate. A ZEV mandate will not make a difference in a globally constrained world. There are supply chain pressures virtually across every single industry. The global semiconductor shortage is just one example of that. I mean, even Apple has cut iPhone production by 10 million units last year simply because they didn't have the chips. So you can mandate EV sales. It won't make a difference in a globally constrained world. Manufacturers are moving, they're investing, but these things don't happen overnight. The auto supply chain based on gas-powered engines has taken over 100 years to make it as efficient as it is today. You can't flip a switch and expect that suddenly, we'll switch out the gas engine and we'll put in an electric powertrain. It takes time. And that's why the ZEV mandate, it's unnecessary, it's redundant, it won't make a difference. And manufacturers are already heading in this direction. All you have to do is read the newspaper any given day and you'll see the announcements that are being made.
Okay. A question or a comment from Glenn. 2/3 of vehicle sales in Canada are used and 1/3 are new. This obviously impacts average purchase price and consumer decisions. I suspect your focus is mostly on the new side of things. Any comments on the used EV marketplace and how it factors into, overall adoption?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my focus is, of course, on new, but the reality is that the used auto market is extremely important for Canadians, and particularly, not everybody has the ability to go out and purchase a new vehicle every few years. So the used market is going to be important for EV adoption, particularly as you see more EVs entering the used automotive market. So there are a couple of things. There's been some ideas floated in some provinces putting forward incentives on used EVs. I think there's merit to that. And then the other thing to look at too is scrappage. And it was something that was talked about in the early stages of the pandemic, where we saw new sales decline quite significantly as lockdowns hit, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the direction of the economy. But at some point, we're going to want to turn over the automotive fleet faster and help people that may be driving an older vehicle, likely going to be a higher polluting vehicle if it's from a long time ago. How do you help those people make the switch? You can incentivize them into a used, or you can put in the market a scrappage program where they scrap the vehicle, it comes off the road, and they get an incentive for doing so to purchase a new vehicle. So there are some models out there. I don't think we're necessarily at the point where that's necessary, but we will get there eventually.
Thank you. This one, I think I know what the answer is, but I'll raise it and let you answer it. In the slide of OEM EV commitments, why are Tesla and the other, EV only manufacturers absent?
The reason for that is because that was the purpose of that slide, is just to show the pace of transformation from the traditional big players. So there's no point including Tesla in that slide because they don't have an EV sales target. All they build is EVs. So that's the reason. It's to demonstrate the fact that this transition is happening, and it's happening increasingly rapidly over the past few years. And that's what the dots denote, all of the announcements made by your traditional global players who've built their business on the ICE vehicle.
Okay, thank you. I'm just scrolling through questions, looking for ones we haven't covered. Are you aware of any business subsidies for companies looking to install EV infrastructure?
Yeah, so there are both through NRCan and some of their charging infrastructure programs. Now, the Canada Infrastructure Bank has been given funds for charging. It's looking at more large-scale projects at this point, although I think they're still in the design phase of that program. So there are programs available, but I'm happy you raised it because it's a really important point. And we see a lot of interest from businesses in electrifying their fleets, be it a rental car fleet, a delivery van fleet. But the reality is, with that transition to occur, companies do need to build out, usually depending on how quickly they need to turn over the vehicles and how long they have to be on the road to be profitable. You've got to have a central charging station, usually with fast chargers in place. And that's expensive. That's an expensive proposition. Yes, there will be savings over time on fuel, but making that, you want to make sure that the spreadsheet that the company is making that investment decision on ultimately works for them. And so having government support there to help with those purchases and that installation is important. And it's not cheap. I've got examples of companies that have done this, and it can be extremely expensive, particularly if you need to upgrade your transformer capacity, or you have to bring new grid or new lines into your facility to support it. It can be very, very expensive. So yeah, there is some support there, but not enough, I would argue.
Okay. Here's an interesting one. I think we can squeeze in one or two more before Tim cuts us off. Will Canada ever match EU standards for vehicles so that we can import more EU EVs?
Standards from what perspective? Safety, emissions?
I assume basically yes. Everything we would need to import more European type vehicles.
Well, so if you look at the Canada-European Trade Agreement, there are elements of that there. That said, as I noted at the outset, we are totally integrated with the US. That's the nature of not just the automotive market, frankly, but the broader Canadian economy. We have a north-south integration because that is our largest trading partner, and it's the gravity model of trade. You do most trade with the market that is closest to you and the largest market. So any sort of decoupling from that long history of alignment would have broader economic consequences for the Canadian economy. So that's why you'll hear us speaking regularly about the need to keep our emission standards aligned, keep our safety standards aligned, so that anything built in Canada or the US, one product, tested once, certified once for the North American market. That's the mantra, and that's what makes us competitive and successful.
Okay, thank you for getting through so many questions. Tim, I'll hand things back to you.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you, Brian. I have to say it's kind of interesting. I know we're hearing really sort of the answer to the question coming from the manufacturers, and I'm aware that there are a lot of different opinions and ideas about how we might accelerate EV adoption. And it was interesting to hear a comment on ZEV mandates, because I know that for example, California, which I think you used as a potential model for certainly for charging, California employs ZEV mandates, and they've had very good success with that. And now I realize when you're talking globally, it's a closed system. And what we want to have in Canada is our share of these vehicles coming here and on our roads. So I'm not going to write off ZEV mandates at this stage. I think there is some merit, and it's still worth discussing. Fair that we can agree or agree to disagree. And there's some other great ideas too, I think that we're going to put on the table, and I think we're going to do that next month, as you'll hear. But I appreciate it. I think it's good to have a healthy discussion about this, and to get a little bit of insight into what the manufacturers are thinking and what their approach to this is. So thank you very much, Brian. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Great discussion, and really happy to be here.
Yeah, there are only 35 or 40 more questions, so I guess that we hit a nerve there. And Jason, thanks a lot. I know it's hard juggling all those questions, and you did a great job again tonight. I really appreciate it. And a shout out to the entire webinar team, Chris Guernsey, who does the technical work, and Anise Sharifi, who gets the word out through social media on our behalf. It wouldn't happen with all those great folks. So next month, we're going to keep this conversation going, and we're going to get to hear from two really great experts in the EV and clean energy space, specifically Daniel Breton, and President of Electric Mobility Canada, and Joanna Kariasis, Program Manager for Clean Energy Canada. Today, we learned about the actions that Canada's auto manufacturers believe are the steps necessary to supercharge adoption, but there are differing perspectives, and Daniel and Joanna will share what they believe are the critical actions needed to ensure Canada can meet its EV adoption targets. And they'll also address the issue of EV affordability, because that's a question that always comes up, and affordability in Canada is worth discussing. So be sure to mark the date for that episode. It will be Tuesday, August 2nd at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so from all of us at Electric Vehicle Society, until next month, stay well. This concludes today's webinar.